Listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to this morning's Policy and Practice webinar on how to future-proof your council tax reduction scheme for universal credit. I'm very happy that you can join us. Before we get into the webinar, my name is Janet Harkin, and I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping and hosting of the event today. So just while we do that, if I could ask you very quickly to give me an audio check. And the way to do that, if you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, is to look at the panel on your right-hand side and basically to raise your hand digitally and give it a wave and let me know that you're there. So if you could do that, I'd be very grateful. And while you do that, if I could just let you know that with our webinars, what we do, we like you to ask questions throughout. And again, just looking at thank you everybody for your hands. If you just ask your questions in the same panel on the right-hand side, and please do that throughout. There will be a section right at the very end of the webinar where we'll go through the questions, and indeed we'll try and open the mics or the technology, as long as the technology is with us, we'll open the mics and give you a chance to chat to our speakers today. I have a survey at the end of the webinar, no polls today, but a very quick survey at the end of the webinar for you to request further information. We're definitely going to get you on your way by 11:30 because we know how busy everybody's mornings are. So that is the time that we're aiming to finish today. Okay, so without further ado, Daniel, if you could move on. So I'd like to introduce our speakers to you today. First of all, I have Paul Howarth from the Welfare Reform Club, who we work very closely with in policy and practice. Many of you may already know Paul. He's a founding director of the Welfare Reform Club, which promotes the role of local authorities in welfare reform programme, and it supports them to deliver welfare effectively. Paul's worked for DWP and its predecessors for 38 years before retiring in 2011. And in the last 10 years of his time at DWP, Paul was responsible for agreeing with ministers the overall strategy for housing benefit, council tax benefit and income support for mortgage interest. As well as delivering an extensive reform programme, Paul regards one of his main achievements at DWP as transforming the relationship with local authorities through better engagement and communication. And over the years, Paul says he has a very strong commitment to deliver welfare reform and believes success can only be achieved if central and local government work effectively together with a range of stakeholders. And as I mentioned, we work very closely, we're delighted to work very closely with the Welfare Reform Club in policy and practice on projects such as what we're talking about today, CTRS schemes. And then our next speaker is Daniel Cavanilas, who is our operations manager at Policy and Practice. Daniel has a BA in International Relations from Kiel University and an MA in Global Studies from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. His research interests include the use of online tool in politics and different European welfare models. He's very much a linguist. He speaks 9 different languages and is currently learning Persian. So you could talk to him in any language you like. But when he's not sitting at his desk, Daniel enjoys kayaking and traveling as well as his languages. Okay, so that's who, and it's always very nice to put faces to the voices that you're going to hear shortly. So today, the agenda that we're going to talk through, we're going to talk a little bit about policy and practice, the challenges ahead for local authorities, and look at what we do for council tax reduction schemes and examples of our past works with some clients of ours. And I think that's probably where we're going to spend most of the time. Dan is going to walk through some of the actual examples of work that we've done with particular clients, and hopefully throughout that emphasise how we could help with your CTRS challenges. And indeed, that's what I'd like to see in the questions coming through is whatever obscure challenges you may have or questions you may have about universal credit and CTRS, now is the time to ask those questions. If we can't answer them, we will definitely get back to you offline. Okay, so a little bit then about policy and practice. And basically, policy and practice, we make the welfare system simple to understand so that people can make the decisions that are right for them. That is our driving force, that's our mission, if you like. That's what gets us up in the morning. This onion diagram, as I call it, explains a little bit more about what we do. And basically, so policy and practice is a social policy, software and consulting business. And we were founded by Devon Galani. Many of you may know Devon, who was part of the team that developed universal credit at the Centre for Social Justice. And when that policy was adopted by government, Devon left there to set up policy and practice. And he was keen to ensure that the policy intent was actually put into practice. Since then, and together with the team, he's built a policy and practice. Devon's facilitated conversations between leading local authorities and the Prime Minister's office to ensure frontline feedback about welfare reform policy has been heard and indeed continues to be heard. In addition, Devon and the team have helped local organisations to understand the aggregate and cumulative impact of welfare reform changes on their customers so that they can accurately target support programmes. And finally, then to close the loop, the software that Policy and Practice has developed simplifies the conversations that frontline advisors can have with customers by clearly showing what benefits they can get under the current system and also when they move to universal credit, comparing the two systems side by side using data visualization. So that's very much an overview of what Policy and Practice does, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of a context before I now hand over to Paul to talk about the CTRS stuff. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Janet, for that introduction. I'd like to start with a bit of overall context on council tax reduction schemes before Daniel talks about some of the more detailed work that we can do working with you in local authorities. And here are some of the main points about this overall context. First of all, clearly the responsibility for policy has now been devolved. This is now a local authority responsibility. There are, of course, some restrictions still. For example, you still have to operate effectively a council tax benefit scheme for pensioners. But for working age, local authorities do now have the opportunity to vary the policy and decide themselves on such issues as the size of the taper, capital limits, and who loses or gains overall. This is part of the government's localisation programme, and some would describe this as a bit of a postcode lottery, but others would describe it as deciding policies locally to meet local needs. But you do have this ability now to vary schemes, and this is something that could well be very helpful in terms of how we address the future. Obviously, council tax reduction schemes are part of the wider role for local authorities in welfare reform. And this is, I think this role is not shrinking as fast as we might have thought some years ago. It now appears that local authorities are going to keep responsibility for housing benefit for pensioners, for example, for some time to come. Obviously, we've got discretionary housing payments, which are growing in importance, it seems to me. We have local welfare schemes, the Old Social Fund, and of course council tax reduction. So I think this is part of a kind of vital role, really, as I see it, for local authorities in protecting vulnerable households. But of course the budget has been cut. Obviously there was a 10% cut, as you all know, at the outset when council tax benefit was abolished in 2013 and council tax reduction schemes came into being. I don't think there's any I haven't heard anybody or any minister give any real policy justification for this cut. I think it is one of those cuts that was really about helping to meet the budget deficit rather than anything else. But it has been cut, and of course since then it has been very difficult for local authorities to know exactly how much money is allocated to council tax reduction schemes, since it's all been merged with part of the overall grant. but basically the money that was originally allocated is certainly not going to keep pace with likely demand. The schemes are cash limited. We know that local authority welfare is now pretty much cash limited, so it won't be fully funded if demand does increase. So that means that it really is important to get people into work, to ensure that the caseload remains as low as it possibly can, in a sense, by getting people into work, because that will have a direct effect then on the costings. And of course, administrative savings are important now as well. Getting more important. In the work that we do on designing council tax reduction schemes, we can make some reasonable assumptions about administrative savings. There are many ways of trying to describe and calculate administrative savings, some of which are better than others, but I think we can make some pretty good assumptions so that we can help sort of look at which options are likely to to create more admin savings than others, if you like. And moving towards a discount would be one way of doing that. A complete discount scheme would perhaps be desirable. It would need to merge with the single person's discount, which you can't do at the moment. But may be expensive. But we can, I think, devise schemes which move towards that, if that's an objective. For example, we've calculated schemes that pay by income band, so that there is less means testing overall, and you simply say, well, if your income is between X and Y, you'll get 100%. If it's between A and B, you'll get 80% or whatever. So it can be done. And then there's of course, the implications of universal credit, which we're touching on today. And since the summer budget, obviously the reduction or the cuts to universal credit have changed the picture overall. Many people now are going to be worse off than they would have been before, and those factors need to be addressed when devising your council tax reduction scheme. So does the migration to universal credit, because we can make some good assumptions based on when you think that your migration will take place about how quickly people will flow onto universal credit. And we know, for example, that private rented sector cases will flow onto universal credit faster than social rented sector cases, for example, because there's more churn in their claims. So, that is an important factor. Data sharing, I think, with DWP is going to be important too, because we need to understand what it is, what data you'll be able to get, and what you'll readily be able to see, either through the universal credit claim or through the customer information service. And we need to decide also whether your scheme will reflect universal credit type rules on issues like non-dependence. Moving to this slide, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but just to show you that the research organisation called the New Policy Institute has done a lot of work on existing council tax reduction schemes, starting in 2013 and monitoring what has happened to those schemes since. This chart refers to the 326 councils in England. It doesn't cover Wales and Scotland, where things are slightly different. But it just monitors what's been going on in the councils of England. And you can see that the green bar is the latest one, 2015-16 schemes, and the grey bar is the first schemes to come into being in 2013-14. And you can see here that, for example, if you look at the top set of bars, that the number of councils who were basically running the council tax reduction scheme as a CTB scheme, as it was over 50 at the beginning at the start of 2013, but that number is gradually reducing. Similarly, if you look at the bottom, number of councils who are requiring some kind of contribution, minimum payment, if you like, for at least some groups of working age households. That was well over 200 at the start and is increasing now around 250. Councils require or restrict the eligibility to, say, 75 or 80% of council tax liability. So there are various other options here. There's a lot of information on this on the New Policy Institute website. So if you do want to find out, more about what councils are doing generally, that is a good place to go. And of course, we can help with that too. So if we go on to the next slide. Finally, from me, I just want to say a little bit about where we should be going, really. I think the first important thing is that local authorities do understand the cumulative impact of welfare reform in their area. That really is a starting point. Janet has already said that's something that we can help with. But it means looking at the whole spectrum and trying to work out, including council tax reduction schemes, but trying to work out who really is going to be affected the most by, several reforms. Perhaps some people will be affected by more than one reform, and that information is quite important, really, so that you know who it is that you might want to give more help to, perhaps in council tax reduction schemes or DHPs and so forth. I think the implications for local authorities going forward are that, partly because of the budget cuts, but also partly because I think increasingly local authorities and others are beginning or are developing more work which is sort of not in silos. They're integrating various departments and funding streams, so that in a sense what would happen in this situation is that somebody would come to the local authority for some form of help, not necessarily claiming anything in particular, but come for help. They would be triaged into the most effective form of help that they could be provided with, and of course working with partners and agencies is increasingly important in that way. So having done that, I think it's it is important for local authorities to be clear about what how various council tax reduction schemes can what effect they have, and this is the sort of modelling that we do, which Daniel will talk about in a minute. And we can provide information on the effects of various schemes on the type of household, tenure, economic status, those in work, those not in work, and so on. And that information clearly is going to be very important to decide, how a scheme should be developed in accordance with your overall objectives. And of course, people will always turn to local authorities when in difficulty. That's always been the case, and I don't think that will change. So that's something that will continue. So that's me, just a general overall introduction. I'll now go over to Daniel, who will take you through some of the detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Janet, as well, for your introduction before. So I'm just going to go ahead and first of all explain what our general approach to council tax support modelling is. And I'm then going to move on to a few examples of work we've done for different local authorities, so you can really understand what it is we're talking about in practice. In terms of our approach, what we do is we use your household level data. So this means basically housing benefit data or council tax support data to model the current scheme that is in place at your local authority to a very high degree of accuracy. And this is not an issue because all local authorities hold this data and it's standardized, so it's very easy for us to get hold of that and analyze it very accurately. Once we have modeled the current scheme in place, then we can model different changes to that scheme that you may want to look at, and we can combine that with the effects of welfare reform and the rollout of universal credit. And finally, once that is done, we can then move on to show you the effects of different schemes that you're considering. So, for example, for each scheme, we can tell you who the winners and losers would be, what the effects would be by tenure, by household type, or by economic status, like Paul mentioned just a minute ago. And generally, we can tell you the strengths and weaknesses of every different model that you're considering, and perhaps most importantly, what the overall cost would be of these schemes. I'm going to move on to talk about one early example we have of work we've done on this. This was a project we did for North Hertfordshire Council, which is a relatively small local authority with few claimants of council tax support at the moment. And their issue was quite interesting because in their case, they were very happy with the way their council tax support scheme was designed. They were happy that it was helping the people who needed most help. The only problem is that they were underspending. They were predicted to spend about £500,000 less than their budget in the coming year. So they came to us with the question, how much can we afford to increase our support by? And of course, the tricky bit of this was that these were the times when the tax credit cuts had been announced in the summer budget. And of course, before the Chancellor of the Exchequer completed this U-turn and said that the tax credit cuts would not go ahead. So at the same time, there was also the fear that if tax credit cuts lowered the income of people who were claiming council tax support, it could also drive demand up for support. So they wanted to take those two factors into account and see exactly how much they could increase the support by. And another key thing that they wanted to model was if they made the council tax support scheme more generous, it could mean that people who do not currently claim council tax support would begin to claim it or would become eligible for it. So they also wanted to make sure that we took into account the fact that the caseload could increase if the scheme were more generous. So I tried to put this challenge into a more visual pattern, and what you can see here is essentially what I explained just now. The council was spending below their budget, so they wanted to bring their expenditure up. At the same time, they were worried that as tax credit cuts brought claimants' incomes down, people would be entitled to more council tax support, and this would bring expenditure up naturally. So they wanted to find essentially the ideal point where they would increase support to spend more of their budget, but this would not bring them above their budget if you take the tax credit cuts into account. And in terms of the work we did, we modeled their current scheme very accurately. Then we moved on to model what the situation would look like if the tax credit cuts came into place this year, because they were scheduled for next month, I believe. And we were then able to remodel their scheme at higher levels of support until we reached that optimal level that I was talking about, which is the point where the council is using most of their budget, accounting for welfare cuts, but at the same time not in danger of overspending. We found two key things, I think, here. The first one is that actually the effects of the tax credit cuts on the council tax support scheme would be relatively limited. This is in part because people who claim council tax support don't usually receive tax credits, so the effects would be limited in this sense. And then the other thing we found was basically the answer to their question. which is that they could increase their support for non-protected working age households by about 12%, and they would still have a financial cushion for unexpected changes. So we found that 12% was the ideal increase. They could potentially increase it a bit more, but that would put them in danger of overspending. The next case I want to talk about is Leeds Council, which was actually one of the first council tax support models that we ever did. And here the challenge was quite a bit broader. The council wanted to future-proof their scheme for the different welfare reforms and for the rollout of universal credit, which were just around the corner. And in addition to that, they also wanted to make sure that their council tax scheme was fair for everyone, taking into account that welfare cuts were going to hurt many different people. So the goal was to make sure that the council tax support scheme did not hurt those who would be hurt by other government reforms, unless absolutely necessary. Another area of focus for Leeds Council were work incentives. In this sense, they wanted to see if their council tax support scheme could encourage people to move into work or to work more hours and reduce their dependency on benefits. And finally, they also wanted to reduce their payments of council tax support and invest more money and more time on other forms of support, like face-to-face time with residents. So what we did was this. We modeled 5 different schemes that the council wanted us to look at. And we evaluated essentially the winners and losers of each scheme. We graded the schemes on 4 different categories. The first one was work incentives. So in other words, does this scheme encourage people to move into work or to work more hours? The second one was financial cost. So is this scheme expensive? Could it bring the council over budget? The third one was political cost, which is understanding whether a particular scheme could be challenged by voters and residents in general. And finally, we also looked at the administrative burden, which is whether any particular scheme would have high administrative costs, particularly when it comes to means testing, because we all know that means testing a council tax support claim is very costly and very time consuming. And the schemes that we modeled were quite varied. I think some interesting ones included, for example, removing protections for disabled households, so that if a household was receiving a disability premium, they couldn't receive 100% of their council tax bill in support, but instead a bit less. Another example would be the DCLG scheme, which integrates better with universal credit. And a few interesting things that we found when doing this modeling, firstly, I think, was that financial work incentives were really hard to apply in a council tax support. So even in the most work incentive friendly scheme that we modeled, the financial work incentives were actually quite small. And this is simply because out of all the benefits that a claimant receives, council tax support is actually usually the least important one in financial terms. So it's really hard to apply financial work incentives through council tax support. However, a different question is about whether if you save money in payments and invest more time and money on face-to-face interactions with your clients, you could improve work incentives. And in terms of what Leeds received at the end of all this modeling, they received a report with an in-depth breakdown of each one of the 5 schemes, so that then they could send the recommendations to members, taking account of the local situation. So in other words, Leeds were able to make a more informed decision on a subject that would affect tens of thousands of people. And finally, I'm going to go a bit more in depth into the work we've done for Newcastle City Council, which was a more recent report that we did. Here the challenge was quite broad. The council wanted to cut expenditure on council tax support payments to be able to support residents in other ways, a bit like Leeds. They were also worried about the fast rollout of universal credit, because this was challenging the current scheme. Administrative complexity was another concern, and so were arrears. Both administrative complexity and arrears meant that the council was having to spend a lot of money means testing and processing claims and also trying to collect arrears. So wherever possible, Newcastle wanted to cut administrative costs and also to reduce the levels of arrears. They asked us to model 6 different schemes and see which one of them covered all angles better. So what we did was indeed model the 6 different schemes, accounting for next year's increase in council tax rates. And we analysed each one of the schemes in terms of, a bit like we did with Leeds, work incentives, financial cost, administrative complexity, political risk, and here we added an additional category, which was arrears. And the intention here was to figure out whether each different scheme would carry with it a risk that arrears would increase as a consequence of claimants losing support. And other modelling that we've also done includes, for example, making an assumption as to how fast the rollout of universal credit is going to go and how council tax support claimants who transition into universal credit will receive more or less support in financial terms. In terms of the specific schemes that we modelled for Newcastle, initially there were 6. First of all, there was a no change scheme, which was simply leaving the current scheme as it was for next year. The second one was the current scheme at a higher level of support. If I remember correctly, they wanted to increase the support that claimants could receive from 80% of their bill to a maximum of 85% of their bill. And the goal of this was simply to understand the cost implications of giving more support to claimants. The third one was removing protections so that households in receipt of disability benefits would no longer be entitled to up to 100% of their bill in support. The fourth one was what we called a self-employed workers scheme, and this simply means applying the minimum income floor to self-employed workers. So, for example, if a self-employed worker tells me that she's working 16 hours, but she declares very low earnings, we would assume that for each one of those 16 hours a week, she's earning at least the minimum wage, and we would means test the council tax support accordingly. The fifth scheme was an administratively simple scheme, which is one that Paul mentioned earlier, and this one involves creating different income bands and saying if your income is between X and Y, you can receive 80% of your bill in support. If your income is between Y and Z, you can only receive 60, and then so on for 40, 20, and nothing. And this one is particularly useful for universal credit because, as you may know, under universal credit, all you're going to see is a particular claimant's universal credit payment, rather than seeing their housing benefit, their job seekers allowance, their tax credits, and so on. So you're going to have to decide whether you want to take all universal credit income into account or nothing. And the administratively simple scheme takes care of this. And the final scheme that we modelled at first was a work incentive scheme, which again is basically the DCLG proposal to merge this into universal credit. You'll see that there's a number 7 in there, there's a hybrid. I'll go into that a bit later, but at first we only modelled 6. And these are the conclusions that our analysis reached, expressed in a table. So as I said, we saw each one of these models in terms of work incentives, financial cost, administrative cost, political risk, and arrears. For the no change option, which was keeping the scheme as it was, it had no major consequences either way because it was keeping the status quo. However, the council wanted something better, so this was not the ideal option. Then there was the option of higher support. This, of course, would have no political risk because most people would be happy to have more support. It would improve the arrears situation, but it would have a negative consequence for the council in terms of financial costs because they would be spending more money. Then there's this scheme of removing protections for disabled claimants, and this is basically the inverse. Financial cost would go down because you would be offering less support, but this would be a tricky scheme to implement in terms of political risk because you're hurting disabled households, and in terms of arrears because many more people could accumulate council tax arrears. The self-employed workers scheme we found would have almost negligible effects. This is mostly because there are simply very few self-employed workers in any council tax support caseload. So even if you ask them to pay more of their bills, it's going to have a very small scheme, a very small effect in the grand scheme of things. The administratively simple scheme would have a very positive effect on administrative costs, and it would also be relatively good in terms of political risk, because people would have an easier time understanding what the council tax support scheme implied, and that's always a positive. However, it would have a net negative effect on arrears. We found that more people would fall behind with their council tax payments if this scheme was implemented. And finally, there's the work incentives, or the UC integrated scheme, which would have a positive influence on work incentives. It would be cheaper than the current scheme, but in terms of political risk, it would be quite bad, because it wouldn't integrate very well with those claimants who are still receiving the current benefit system, and it would have a negative effect on arrears as well. So to kind of bring this all together, what Newcastle found was that no scheme is perfect. All schemes, as we see in this table, have strengths and weaknesses, so which one is chosen is likely to be a political decision more than anything. And this is going to depend largely on the council's priorities. What Newcastle agreed to do here was to create a bit of a hybrid of two of the other schemes, because they saw that the scheme that removes protections for disabled people would have positives and negatives, and so would the one that offers higher support to working age households. So they asked us to bring those two together and run a hybrid where disabled people would no longer be protected, but support for all working age households would go up from a maximum of 80% to a maximum of 85%. And here they reached the conclusion that this was probably the ideal scheme for the time being, because some of the negatives of one scheme would be counteracted by the positives of the other scheme, and vice versa. And I think this shows how flexible our system is, because we can really play around with different schemes and different options, and we're very flexible in terms of doing what you want to see, and we give you the opportunity to just be creative and tell us what you want to see in your council tax scheme, and we can tell you the effects of that. So really the question here is, do you know how you can future-proof your council tax support? Do you think you could model the kind of work we've done for North Herts and Newcastle without our modelling tools? If you want to get an idea of what some other councils have done with our analysis, there's also the example of Birmingham City Council, who identified households most vulnerable to welfare reforms, and they mapped local support onto local needs to apply a more strategic approach to local support. North Hertfordshire, as we've discussed, accurately forecasted the cost of CTRS, and they helped to eliminate a pretty big underspend. Leeds City Council developed a new approach to local support, and they were able to use their analysis to justify their decision to Cabinet, which is often very difficult. Melton is another council we've worked with. They used their analysis on the most heavily impacted households by welfare reform, and then they were able to focus their support on those households. And finally, Newcastle are in the process of building a big data hub to track, first of all, the impact of reforms on their population, and secondly, perhaps most importantly, the effectiveness of interventions. So to bring this all together, I think from the different case studies, we've seen how our modeling can help you to forecast expenditure in upcoming years, like we did to a very high degree of accuracy for North Herts. We can help you to account for the rollout of universal credit, so you can see how, as more people transition onto the new system, their entitlements under council tax support are going to change, and of course the same for all other welfare reforms, such as the lower benefit cap. We can also model a higher take-up rate as a result of changes to the scheme or welfare reforms. We can, of course, break down the effects that any one of the schemes we model will have on different households or different tenure types or different economic statuses. We can calculate administrative costs, which is a growing issue, I believe, because more and more money is being spent on administration and probably less and less on actual support. And finally, we can also model the effect on arrears levels. So if you think that a scheme is very good, but then we find out that actually that scheme could increase arrears levels, then you may have to think twice about implementing that scheme, because arrears are also very costly to deal with. And I think now I'm going to hand it over to Janet to wrap this up.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Paul, as well. A lot of food for thought there. So I would like now to open it up to everybody who's on the call and to ask some questions of the presentations that Daniel and Paul have just given. And just to set the ball rolling on that, if I may, I'm going to start with a bit of a humdinger. And then I have a question that was submitted previously as well. Actually, maybe I'll start with the humdinger first, because that's a bit mean. But how would, Daniel and Paul, how would you design a CTRS scheme to best fit with universal credit, in your opinion?
Do you want me to have a go first? Just to say one or two things about that. It's very difficult, actually, given the pace of change, to keep up, because what might have been a very good fit with universal credit a while ago might not now be very good because of the changes to universal credit work allowances and other factors. So it isn't. It's not an easy one to answer. I mean, I think there are two parts to it. First of all, it's probably as well to think about incorporating in your council tax reduction scheme some of the elements that have changed under universal credit. So, for example, the new rules for non-dependents, as we talked about already, the new rules for self-employed people, and perhaps even something on the work allowances. And of course there are a host of other things that have changed or will change under universal credit. So you might want to incorporate some of that into your council tax reduction scheme. The other part to the question is really how it fits with the most fundamental part of universal credit, which is work incentives and tapering out income. And at the moment, I think probably the best fit there, short of actual integration with universal credit, which I don't think is on the agenda at all, would be to look at some of the options that have been suggested. Daniel mentioned the DCLG option, which I think sort of looks at the income that's left over after the universal credit taper rate of 65% has been applied, and then applies a further 20% to that. None of these are perfect, really, because they all marginally increase the overall marginal deduction rate, if you like. So the taper rate becomes 68, 70 or whatever, so people lose out on that. In other words, they don't gain as much by progressing in work. But it's very difficult to get around that, I think. Also, of course, the third point perhaps to make, we have covered this, is that it would be good to run a scheme which aligns with the migration of universal credit, so takes that into account as well. I'm not sure that gives you the you're looking for, Janet, but it's about the best I can do, I think, at the moment.
Great, thank you, Paul. Daniel, I don't know whether you've had anything to add to that, or indeed maybe you could answer this next question as well, which is...
Well, I do have a very minor thing to add to what Paul said. And this is just of the experience we've had with Newcastle, where, as I went through before, we modeled 6, eventually 7 different schemes. And what they found was that they essentially needed one scheme to get them through the rollout, and that was the hybrid scheme that I described, because it was the best scheme when it comes to applying to a part of the population that is on UC and the part of the population that is on the current benefit system. And then they almost scheduled for a few years down the line to evaluate the schemes again and see if they can implement a different scheme once universal credit is fully rolled out. So it could be that for the next 3 years or so, you want to apply one scheme, and then once the rollout is complete, eventually, you may want to implement another scheme, for example, the administratively simple one. But again, that is probably a political decision as much as.
That's a good point, Daniel.
Just on that point about timeframes, the question is coming about how quickly can you do it? How quickly can you do the analysis?
Mm-hmm. So usually from a technical perspective, we're talking about 5 to 6 weeks or so. I believe now time constraints for most local authorities are not very important because you probably have about 11 or 12 months to get this started for next year. But if you do have time constraints, that is the time we're looking at, 5 to 6 weeks.
Great. Okay. I have a question that was sent in before the webinar, and apologies if you've kind of covered this already in your answers to the previous questions, but this particular question is from a council, and the person says, we're looking to revise our scheme to be more discount orientated rather than means tested like housing benefit. Do you know of any of the local authorities doing this, or do you have a view?
So my view from having worked with different local authorities is that pretty much everyone is considering this discounted scheme, but I don't think anyone has implemented it yet. So I get the feeling that it's just going to take the one local authority to take the leap, and then many others are going to move over to it. So nowadays, pretty much every local authority we work with is looking at this. Whether or not they implement it is a different question.
Okay. Okay. I'm just wondering, if anybody has any further questions, or indeed, oh, sorry. Okay. What, in your view, is the ideal hybrid scheme to get us through? Is a question that's just popped up. Get us through UC rollout. Or does that differ so much by type of authority?
I think it is likely to differ a lot by type of authority and also in terms of the biggest issues that you have, whether they are administrative costs or arrears or cost in general. But I think if you do the kind of analysis that I've shown before, you're likely to be able to detect where one scheme is strongest and where one scheme is weakest, and then you can understand if you bring them together, you can probably counteract the weaknesses and with the positives. But it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer.
I think that probably is the answer that I think you're going to say to another question that's come in, which is very much about can you confirm how much the modelling costs, please? I think. Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, it does vary by local authority, so it depends on the size of the local authority and how many claimants you currently have. But there are some colleagues on this call who will surely get in touch to get an idea of this. Yeah,
and indeed that is something that I don't see any more questions popping up. So maybe, Daniel, if you wanted just to move to the next steps, because that's a nice measure into into the next step. So at the end of this webinar, when we close down the webinar, you'll automatically get a very short survey. It was just asking 2 questions for feedback on what Daniel and Paul presented, whether there are any areas that you'd like more information on. And also then there's the opportunity to request some additional information. So, for example, if you wanted to see some of the existing client reports, we have got permission from some of our clients to share their finished final reports with you, with other local authorities who may be similar in structure, demographics or strategic vision to your own organisation. So we're very grateful to those clients as well, because that is very much our ethos, really, is to share the good practice. So we're very happy to share those reports where we have that permission. Indeed, we can also talk to you about pricing details. As Daniel says, it does vary by organisation and by local authority. And also there is just a customer testimonials ebook if you wanted to just hear some more from our other customers. So I think, Daniel and Paul, unless there are any burning points that you want to say, want to end up with, we just want to emphasise again, we've sort of reached the end of the content for today's webinar. Daniel, Paul, any extra thoughts?
No, I just want to thank everyone for being so attentive.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening. It is a very complex area, and I think we would be very pleased to come and speak to you or speak to you on the phone about what might be best for you. So thank you very much.
Excellent. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Paul. And I leave you with this slide here, which is something that we find quite interesting in our organisation. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion, says W. Edwards Deming, who is a data scientist. So I leave you on that thought. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention today. You'll get a recording of this webinar, and please do feel free to share it with your colleagues. And like I say, there's a very short survey coming up whereby you can request some extra information to take this further. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.